On an icy road above Spearfish Canyon, Tate Calder pressed the brake and felt nothing. The retired Navy SEAL had survived war, explosions, and years of being called broken by his own town. But that night, his truck slid through the guardrail and vanished into the snow below. No one saw the crash. No one heard his weak call for help. Except Koda, an old German shepherd rescue dog with a forgotten name and a reason to remember. Stay with this story, and tell me in the comments if you believe loyalty can be one of God's quiet miracles. By late winter, Spearfish Canyon looked less like a place on a map and more like something carved by an old god with cold hands. The cliffs rose dark and narrow above the road, wearing snow in their cracks like white scars. Pines leaned over the canyon walls, their branches heavy, their needles whispering whenever the wind moved through them. In the morning, the creek below the cabin smoked with mist. By sundown, the whole place turned blue and silver, as if the world had forgotten the color of warmth. Tate Calder lived there alone. His cabin sat above a bend in the canyon, tucked behind a stand of black spruce and bare cottonwoods. It was not large, not pretty in the way tourists liked, but it held against weather. The roof sagged slightly over the porch. Firewood stood stacked in uneven rows beside the door. A rusted wind bell hung from one beam, though Tate had not remembered hanging it there. Some days, he remembered everything. Other days, memory came apart in his hands. At 61, Tate still carried the frame of the man he used to be. He stood a little over 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, hard in the arms, with the quiet heaviness of someone who had spent years carrying gear through surf, mud, and places where light did not reach. He had been a Navy SEAL once, and later an EOD man, the kind of soldier who lowered himself into black water and trusted his hands to find death before death found anyone else. Now those same hands sometimes missed the edge of a coffee cup. A blast, years ago, had left something broken inside his skull. Doctors had given it a name. Traumatic brain injury. 3 clean words for a thing that was not clean at all. It brought headaches like iron bands. It stole balance from him without warning. It made his speech catch when stress tightened around his throat. Tate could still field strip a pistol in the dark. He could still read weather by the smell of snow. He could still hear the difference between a loose hinge and a footstep on his porch. But on bad mornings, he had to grip the kitchen counter and wait for the floor to stop tilting beneath him. That was the part Cold Fork noticed. Not the years in uniform. Not the operations no one was allowed to speak about. Not the medals packed in a cigar box under his bed, beside letters he had never answered, and one scorched Navy Challenge coin he kept on a black cord in his coat pocket. The town noticed the stumble, the pause before his words, the way he sometimes stood too long in the aisle of Harlan's grocery, looking at cans of soup as if the labels had changed language while he was reading them. "Old drunk?" someone had muttered once, not quietly enough. Tate had heard it. He had not turned around. That was the curse of small towns. They could remember a man's worst 5 seconds and forget the 40 years before them. Cold Fork sat a few miles from the canyon, a weather-beaten town of brick storefronts, church steeples, feed trucks, and people who knew each other's business before noon. In summer, tourists passed through on their way to scenic drives and trout streams. In winter, the town folded inward. Curtains glowed, tires hissed on packed snow. Men spoke softly in the diner booths and louder after coffee. By February, the story about Tate Calder had grown legs. He was unstable. He lived with guns. He talked to himself. He had nearly fallen outside the pharmacy, He forgot things. He had no family watching him. He was dangerous. A rumor, once released in a town like Cold Fork, did not run. It burrowed. It found warm places behind counters and under church pews. It waited inside polite nods. It sat beside people at breakfast, dressed in concern. No one spread concern better than Dane Whitlock. Dane was a county commissioner, owner of Whitlock Aggregate, and a man who had learned early that power sounded softer when spoken through a smile. He had sandy gray hair brushed neatly to the side, a camel-colored wool coat he wore like a title, and a silver pen engraved with his company logo. He tapped that pen whenever he wanted a room to remember who owned the oxygen. To most of Cold Fork, he was a businessman, a donor, a man who paid for Little League uniforms and stood in the front row at ribbon cuttings. To Tate, he looked like a man who measured people the way quarrymen measured stone, useful, breakable, removable. Whitlock had wanted Tate's land for more than a year. The cabin itself meant nothing to him. The land did. Tate's property lay along a narrow route that could open access to a gravel seam beyond the canyon, and that gravel had become the difference between Whitlock's company staying afloat and sinking under debts he kept hidden behind polished boots and public speeches. He had signed supply promises for a county road project he could not fulfill without new extraction. Worse, the richest seam sat near protected ground, which made permits complicated, expensive, and, in Whitlock's mind, deeply inconvenient. Tate Calder's land was not merely land. It was a locked gate, and Whitlock had begun looking for a legal key. He found one in paperwork, not theft, not open threats. Those were crude. Whitlock preferred clean hands and dirty signatures. He began pushing the idea that Tate was no longer capable of managing his own affairs. Not directly, of course. A commissioner could not appear too eager. So he spoke of public safety. He spoke of dignity. He spoke of protecting a decorated veteran before something tragic happens. Mara Whitlock Pike listened because she had spent most of her life listening to Dane. She worked in county social services, a slight woman in her 40s with tired eyes, a pale gray coat, and a folder always held too tightly to her chest. She was Dane's cousin, though in public he called her one of our most compassionate county workers. Mara knew that praise from Dane was never free. At first, she told herself the review was reasonable. Tate did live alone. He did have neurological symptoms. People had filed complaints. A man could be proud and still need help. That was the sentence she repeated while she signed the request for a preliminary competency evaluation. She did not ask why several complaints had arrived within the same week. She did not ask why the language in them sounded so similar. She did not drive out to Tate's cabin and look him in the eye. Paper was easier than a person. And so, one small signature joined another. A concern form, a witness note, a sheriff's call summary, a report of a man stumbling near the store, a mention of firearms, a line about possible confusion. Each sheet was light enough to lift with 2 fingers. Together, they began to resemble a cage. That afternoon, Tate stood on his porch with one hand against the doorframe, waiting out a dizzy spell. The wind came down from the canyon and slid under his coat collar. His canvas jacket was old, tobacco brown, with a Sherpa collar worn thin in places. Beneath it, he wore a dark navy sweater, the color of deep water. His thumb found the challenge coin in his pocket before he realized he had reached for it. The coin was blackened along one edge. It had belonged to Petty Officer Jonah Vale, 26 years old, who had laughed too loudly, prayed too quietly, and died in a blast Tate had survived. Tate closed his fingers around it until the ridge bit his skin. Still here. he whispered. He was not sure whether he meant himself or Jonah. A sound moved at the edge of the trees. Tate raised his head. At first he saw only shadow between the pines. Then the shadow shifted, and a German shepherd stepped into the pale winter light. The dog was old. That was clear before anything else. His muzzle was silver, not just at the chin but up along both cheeks, giving him the solemn look of a retired judge. His back was black as coal dust, his chest and legs a deep burned brown. One ear stood sharp, the other bent slightly at the tip, as if some old injury had folded it and never quite let go. A faded red rescue collar circled his neck, rubbed thin at the edges. He stood still, watching Tate. Not begging, not growling, just watching. Tate had seen military working dogs before. He knew the difference between a pet waiting for kindness and a working dog deciding whether a man was worth the trouble. "You lost?" Tate asked. The dog did not move. Tate tried to step down from the porch, then felt the world tilt. He caught the post with one hand. The dog's ears lifted. Not much, just enough. Tate breathed through the wave of dizziness until the snow stopped sliding sideways. "Well," he muttered, embarrassed before an audience of one dog. That was graceful. The shepherd took one step forward, then stopped again. Tate looked at the dog's collar. The red had faded almost brown, but a small metal tag still hung from it, scratched and dull. He could not read the engraving from where he stood. The dog's ribs did not show badly, but there was a hollowness around his flanks, a stiffness in one rear leg. Retired, Tate thought. Or discarded. He went inside and found a half bag of dry food left from a stray that had passed through the previous fall. He poured some into a tin pan, then set it near the porch steps. He did not whistle, did not crouch, did not call the dog closer. Old soldiers hated being summoned like pets. So did old dogs, apparently. Tate went back to the doorway and waited. The shepherd looked at the pan, then at Tate, then toward the road below the canyon, as if checking whether the world had set a trap around the food. "Smart," Tate said. "I wouldn't trust me either." The dog's eyes returned to him. They were amber, dark, and steady, with a sadness too disciplined to be called fear. Something in Tate's chest shifted. He had been looked at with pity in town, with suspicion, with impatience, with the thin kindness people gave when they hoped suffering would not ask anything of them. This dog looked at him differently, as if he recognized damage without mistaking it for weakness. Tate leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "They throw you away too?" he asked softly. The dog's right ear, the injured one, dipped. A ridiculous answer, maybe. A coincidence of muscle and cold. Tate knew better than to dress animals in human meaning. But the canyon had gone quiet, and the moment held still around them like a breath. The shepherd stepped forward at last. He ate slowly, pausing every few bites to look up. When the pan was empty, he backed away, not toward town, but toward the trees. At the edge of the pines, he turned once more. Tate lifted 2 fingers. The dog vanished into the dark trunks. That should have been the end of it. A hungry old dog had come for food. An old man had given it. The world was full of small exchanges that meant nothing. But Tate remained on the porch long after the cold had numbed his hands. Below, the canyon creek moved under ice with a sound like distant breathing. Above, evening settled over Black Hill's stone and pine. Somewhere in Cold Fork, men were drinking coffee and speaking his name as if it belonged to them. Somewhere in the county building, paperwork was gathering weight. Tate did not know that the dog had once belonged to the Lawrence County Winter Search and Rescue Unit. He did not know the name Koda. He did not know that the same red collar had passed through hands that wanted certain things buried. He only knew that for the first time in many months, another living creature had stood before him without asking him to explain his wounds. Inside the cabin, the stove clicked and settled. Tate shut the door, crossed the room carefully, and placed one hand on the back of a chair until his balance steadied. On the table lay an unopened envelope from the county. He looked at it, then at the window where the last light was fading. "Not tonight," he said. His voice caught on the second word, but he finished it. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft as ash, and at the edge of the forest, unseen beneath the pines, the old German shepherd stopped, lifted his silver muzzle to the wind, and listened toward the cabin as if something inside that lonely house had called his name. The first complaint arrived on a Tuesday, folded neatly inside a county envelope. Tate Calder found it in his mailbox after walking back from the woodpile with a split log tucked under one arm and a headache pressing behind his right eye. The mailbox stood at the end of his gravel turnoff, half buried in plowed snow, its red flag frozen upright like a warning. He knew the envelope was trouble before he opened it. Paper had a smell when it came from offices. Ink, heat, stale hands, the faint arrogance of things filed by people who did not have to stand in the weather they were describing. Inside was a notice. A neighbor had reported reckless discharge of a firearm near a public access trail. Tate read the sentence 3 times. The words stayed sharp. Their meaning did not. He had fired 1 round 2 days ago, yes, into the air. At dusk. A coyote had been circling the chicken coop behind the old Jensen place down the road, and Tate had scared it off before it got brave. Mrs. Jensen had waved from her kitchen window afterward. She had mouthed, "Thank you." Now the county had turned that same sound into danger. Tate stood beside the mailbox until the cold worked through his gloves. For a moment, he wondered if he had misremembered it. Maybe the trail had been closer than he thought. Maybe someone had been walking there. Maybe his mind had placed Mrs. Jensen at the window because it needed mercy more than truth. That was the cruelest part of the injury. It did not only hurt him, it made him a poor witness to his own life. Down in Cold Fork, lies did not arrive as lies. They arrived as concerns. Dane Whitlock understood that better than anyone. At the Whitlock aggregate office, where framed photographs of gravel pits hung beside photographs of Dane shaking hands with county officials, he sat across from Rusk Harlan and slid a folder over the desk. Rusk did not read it right away. He was a large man in a dust-stained work coat, his shoulders thick from years around quarry machines, his nose crooked from an old fight no one in town had ever heard the true version of. His hands looked capable of bending a wrench or breaking one. "Just need him rattled," Whitlock said. Rusk looked at the folder. "Man already seems rattled." "That's the point." Whitlock tapped his silver pen once against the desk. "People don't believe what you tell them. They believe what they think they noticed first." Rusk gave a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Whitlock leaned back. His camel coat hung neatly on the rack behind him, clean as a sermon. "A broken lock here, tire tracks there. A report from a concerned hiker. Nothing dramatic, nothing stupid." Rusk's eyes flicked up at the last word. Whitlock smiled. "You understand me?" "Yeah," Rusk said. "I understand." He took the folder. By the end of that week, Tate found the padlock on his north gate hanging open. Nothing had been stolen. That bothered him more. A thief took things. A drunk left tracks. A kid broke something and ran. This had the feel of a hand placed on his shoulder in the dark. He walked the fence line slowly, his boots sinking through the crusted snow. The canyon wind moved through the pines with a low, hollow sound. Near the gate, he found tire marks pressed deep in the frozen mud beneath the snow dusting. Wide tires. Heavy truck. The tracks led in, circled near the old shed, then went back out. Tate crouched to study them. His balance shifted. He put one hand down in the snow before he fell. "Easy," he muttered to himself. The word came out clean. That felt like a small victory. He went inside and wrote the date on a yellow pad. North gate lock tampered. Tire tracks. No missing property. His handwriting looked worse than it used to. The letters leaned. The line drifted down the page. He stared at it too long and felt anger rise, hot and useless. Once, his after-action reports had been precise enough that men lived because of them. Now he had to prove to himself that a gate had been opened. The next notice came 3 days later. A report of possible nighttime wandering. Someone claimed to have seen him walking along the canyon road after midnight without proper winter gear. Tate had not left the house that night. At least, he did not think he had. That one stayed with him. He checked his boots by the door. Dry. He checked the floor for melted snow. Nothing. He checked the stove, the latch, the porch rail. Every small fact said he had stayed inside. Still, long after the sun went down, he stood in the kitchen with one hand on the back of a chair, staring at the door. Could a man leave his own house and not know it? He hated the question. He hated that the question had found a place to live. So he bought 3 trail cameras at the hardware store. The young clerk at the counter looked at the boxes, then looked at Tate's face a second too long. "For deer?" the clerk asked. Tate felt the old catch in his throat. Words bunched up like men at a blocked hatch. "Yeah," he said finally. "Deer." The clerk nodded, but his expression had already filed the purchase somewhere unkind. Tate drove home with the cameras on the passenger seat. He told himself they were for wildlife. Elk moved through the canyon. Coyotes tested fences. A mountain lion had taken a dog near Liad the previous winter. But when he mounted the first camera to a pine facing the driveway, he angled it low enough to catch license plates. When he mounted the second near the woodpile, he made sure it could see the porch steps. The third he placed near the north gate. The cameras did not pity him. They did not whisper. They did not forget. That afternoon, Koda appeared again. Tate saw him from the kitchen window, standing beyond the porch where the shoveled path met the trees. Snow had gathered on the old dog's back, turning the black fur speckled gray. The faded red rescue collar showed against his thick neck. "You again?" Tate said through the glass. Koda looked toward the newly mounted camera on the pine, then back at Tate. It was absurd, but Tate almost felt judged. He opened the door and set a tin pan of food on the porch. The dog did not come closer until Tate stepped back inside. Even then, Koda moved like a soldier crossing open ground. He paused, listened, lowered his head, ate 3 mouthfuls, looked up. Tate watched from behind the screen door. "You know something about being recorded?" he asked quietly. Koda's injured ear twitched. Tate gave a dry little laugh. "Don't worry. I'm not sure I trust the machines either." In town, the machines were already doing their work. Mara Whitlock Pike sat at her desk in the social services office, reading a stack of statements under fluorescent light. The room smelled of paper, weak coffee, and old carpet warmed by bad heat. Outside her window, Plow trucks moved along the street, pushing snow into gray banks. Her pale gray coat hung on the back of her chair. She had not taken off her scarf, though the office was too warm. The file on Tate Calder was thicker than she expected. Complaint: reckless firearm use. Concern: possible confusion in grocery store. Concern: living alone with neurological symptoms. Concern: unsecured property access. Concern: nighttime wandering. Mara pressed her thumb against the edge of the folder until it bent. There was a photograph clipped to one form. Tate outside Harlan's grocery, one hand against a brick wall, head lowered. Whoever had taken it had caught him at the worst possible second. A man in distress could look like a man in decline if the camera wanted him to. She thought of driving out to the canyon. She thought of knocking on his door and asking him, plainly, "Mr. Calder, do you need help?" Then she imagined Dane's face if she delayed the evaluation request. Compassion, he had told her, required decisiveness. Mara signed the next page. At Harlan's grocery the following morning, Tate dropped a jar of pickles. It was not dramatic. Not at first. His fingers stiffened around the glass. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Someone behind him laughed too loudly at a joke near the coffee machine, and the sound struck a place inside his skull where echoes still lived. His hand spasmed, the jar slipped, hit the tile and burst open. Vinegar spread around his boots. For 3 seconds, Tate was not in Cold Fork. He was kneeling in black water beside twisted metal, tasting salt and copper through a torn lip, trying to hear Jonah Vale over the ringing after the blast. Then the grocery aisle returned. Pickles, glass, vinegar. A woman at the end of the aisle whispered, "Oh Lord, is he drunk?" Tate bent to pick up the larger shards. His knee touched the floor too hard. He swayed. A young woman in a Navy EMT jacket stepped into the aisle and crouched before anyone else moved. "Sir," she said, calm but not soft. "Look at me." Tate blinked. Her eyes were green-gray, sharp with training rather than fear. Her blonde hair was tied low under a dark knit cap, and a small brass-colored medical penlight was clipped to her front pocket. She did not smell like perfume. She smelled like cold air and antiseptic. "I'm fine," Tate said. The words came out rough, but complete. "I believe you," she said, still going to check. That surprised him more than the fall. She did not ask if he had been drinking. She did not glance at the whispering woman. She held up one finger and moved it slowly. "Follow this with your eyes." He almost refused. Pride rose first. Pride always did. It was old and scarred and dumb as a guard dog that bit the mailman. Then he saw how the young woman had placed herself between him and the aisle, blocking the view of the people watching, not hiding him, shielding him. So he followed her finger. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tate Calder." "Do you know where you are?" "Harlan's grocery, Cold Fork. What day is it?" He hesitated. A murmur stirred behind her. Tate's thumb pressed against the coin in his pocket. Jonah's coin. Burned edge. Black cord. "Thursday," he said. "February 19th. The young woman nodded once. "Good," someone behind them muttered. "Still smells like booze." The EMT turned her head. "It smells like pickles," she said. The aisle went quiet. Tate looked at her then, truly looked. She did not smile as if she had rescued him from humiliation. She simply stood and offered one hand, practical as a rope. "I'm Ren Sundstrom," she said. "EMT. I'm back in town helping my grandfather for a while." Tate accepted her hand because refusing would have been more foolish than proud. Her grip was strong. He stood slowly. "Thank you," he said. This time the words did catch. The thank you. Wren did not finish them for him. She waited. That small mercy struck deeper than pity ever could. Near the front of the store, an old man in an oil-stained blue work jacket watched from beside the coffee urn. Doss Carver had a mechanic's hands, broad and dark in the cracks, and the tired posture of someone who had spent half a life under vehicles and the other half pretending not to hear things he should have answered. He had repaired Tate's truck twice. He knew the man did not drink. He had known it for years. Still, when the whispers started, Doss had poured coffee and kept his mouth shut. Now he watched his granddaughter gather broken glass into a cardboard tray, while Tate stood stiffly beside her, jaw locked against shame. Doss felt something old and unpleasant move under his ribs. Not guilt, exactly. Guilt was too clean a word. This was more like rust breaking loose. After that day, Tate stopped going into town unless he had to. He ate soup from dented cans and repaired small things around the cabin that did not need repairing. He checked the cameras each morning and evening. Most of what they caught was ordinary. Deer nosing through snow, a fox with one black paw, wind moving branches in blue light. Koda came and went. The old shepherd never entered the cabin. He ate only when Tate stepped back, but the distance between them grew smaller by inches no one had agreed upon. One morning, Tate came out too quickly with the food pan. Ice glazed the top porch step. His boot slipped. His shoulder hit the door frame, and for one terrible instant, the canyon spun white and black. Koda lunged forward. Not all the way, just one hard step, muscles gathering under old fur, amber eyes fixed on Tate's knees. Tate caught the rail and steadied himself. The dog froze, as if embarrassed to have been caught caring. Tate breathed once, then gave a low laugh. "Don't worry," he said. "I hate looking soft, too." Koda huffed. It was not quite a bark. It was the closest thing to agreement Tate had heard in weeks. That night, the north camera triggered at 12:43 a.m. Tate did not see the alert until morning. He sat at the kitchen table with coffee gone cold beside his elbow and the memory card loaded into an old laptop that took too long to wake. The first clip showed snow falling in the beam of the infrared sensor. The second showed nothing but wind. The third showed headlights. Tate leaned closer. A gray pickup rolled slowly through the frame near the woodpile. Its plates were crusted with road salt, unreadable. The driver cut the lights. A large man stepped out. The image was grainy, black and white. The man's face turned away, but Tate saw the work coat, the heavy shoulders, the way he moved toward Tate's truck and crouched near the front wheel. At the edge of the frame, another shape appeared. Koda, the old German shepherd, stood rigid in the falling snow, head low, teeth bared toward the man beside the truck. Then he barked. Even without sound, Tate could see the violence of it in the dog's body. The man jerked upright. For a moment, he looked straight toward the trees. Then the clip ended. Tate's hands began to shake. Not fear, not exactly. Something colder. He reached for the phone to call the sheriff's office, then stopped. What would he say? "I have a blurry video of a man near my truck. I think someone is setting me up. I think the whole town is helping them by accident. I think my own mind may be the weakest witness I have." The headache struck before he could finish the thought. White pain bloomed behind his scar. The kitchen tilted. Tate tried to stand, but the chair scraped sideways under him. He caught the table with one hand. The laptop slid an inch, the frozen image still glowing on the screen. Koda's eyes shone in the infrared dark. Tate sank to one knee. Not now, he whispered. But the body has its own chain of command. His fingers closed around the burned coin in his pocket. He held it as if it were a fuse he could keep from lighting. The last thing he saw before lowering his head against the cabinet was the old dog in the video, standing between the trees and the truck, barking at a danger Tate had not yet learned how to name. The hearing notice came before noon. It lay on Tate Calder's kitchen table beside a mug of coffee gone cold, a bottle of pain medication, and the old laptop still frozen on the last frame of the trail camera footage. The image had burned itself into his mind. The gray pickup, the large man near his truck, and Koda standing in the snow with his teeth bared at something Tate had not yet managed to prove. The county envelope was pale blue. Tate hated that. Bad news should have the decency to arrive in black. He opened it with a pocket knife, because his fingers were stiff and because tearing paper with his bare hands felt too much like surrender. The words inside were printed cleanly, professionally, without anger or shame. A preliminary competency hearing had been scheduled. The stated purpose was to determine whether Tate Calder required protective oversight regarding personal welfare and property management. Property management. Tate read that line until the letters blurred. He could survive being called unstable. He could survive a town whispering that he drank, that he had gone strange, that war had left too much shrapnel in the rooms of his mind. Men had said worse things in hotter places, and Tate had learned long ago that words only killed if you let them inside the armor. But property management was different. That meant his cabin, his land, his right to decide when the stove was lit, when the gate was locked, when the trees were left standing, when a stranger was told no. It meant someone was trying to take the pen from his hand while smiling as if they were helping him sign. Tate stood too quickly. The kitchen tilted. He caught the back of the chair and waited for the room to settle. The headache from the morning still pulsed behind his scar, less like pain now and more like a warning light he could not switch off. On the laptop, Koda remained frozen in gray-white night, an old dog in an old war stance. "You saw him," Tate whispered. His own voice sounded rough, uncertain. Outside, the canyon wind moved around the cabin, dragging snow against the windows. Down in Cold Fork, Dane Whitlock stepped out of the county building into the glare of a winter afternoon with 2 local reporters waiting near the steps. He had not called it a press conference. That would have seemed theatrical. He had simply made sure they knew he would be available for a comment on the veteran welfare matter. Whitlock wore his camel wool coat, and a concerned expression practiced enough to look spontaneous. "We are not here to punish Mr. Calder," he said, hands folded in front of him. "Tate served this country, that matters. But service does not erase vulnerability. If a man is alone, injured, confused, and potentially dangerous to himself, then the county has a moral duty to ask hard questions before tragedy strikes." One reporter asked whether the hearing had anything to do with land access near the canyon. Whitlock gave a sad little smile, as if disappointed by the ugliness of the question. "This is about compassion," he said. "Nothing else." The silver pen in his coat pocket caught the light. Across town, in the gravel lot behind Whitlock Aggregate, Rusk Harlan sat in his pickup with both hands on the wheel and a cigarette burning untouched between his fingers. The boss had been clear. A bigger incident. Not a dead man. Whitlock had not said that. He was too careful. Men like Dane never handed you a murder. They handed you a sentence with the sharp edges hidden. Make it obvious he can't manage himself. Make it ugly enough they stop doubting the file. Rusk had done ugly things before. He had threatened suppliers. He had moved boundary stakes. He had dumped waste rock where no one would look until spring. He told himself most men did some version of wrong for a paycheck. But the memory of the trail camera made him uneasy. The dog had seen him. That old shepherd had come out of the trees without a sound, and for 1 second, Rusk had felt like a boy caught stealing from a church collection plate. He crushed the cigarette into the ashtray. "Just a scare," he muttered. The phrase did not comfort him, but it gave his hands something to obey. That evening, Tate forced himself into town. He should have called someone about the camera footage. Wren, maybe. Or the sheriff's office if he could trust them to hear him before they heard the file. But the headache had left him drained, and the medicine bottle was nearly empty. He needed pills. He needed soup. He needed to prove to himself that a Blue County envelope had not turned his life into a room he was afraid to leave. The old truck started on the second try. Its engine coughed, then caught. Tate sat behind the wheel for a moment, both hands resting at 10 and 2, breath slow. The dashboard lights glowed dim green. The challenge coin lay in his coat pocket, warm from his palm. "Store, pharmacy, home," he said. 3 words. A mission small enough not to fail. Koda waited near the tree line when Tate rolled down the driveway. The German shepherd stood half-shadowed between 2 pines, snow powdering his black back and silver muzzle. His faded red collar was barely visible in the dusk, but his amber eyes caught the truck's headlights. Tate braked. The dog did not move aside. "Well," Tate said through the windshield, "that's inconvenient." He lowered the window. Cold air rushed in. "I'll be back before supper, old man." Koda's ears lifted. His body stiffened. Then he barked. Not the low warning Tate had heard in the camera clip. Not a casual complaint. It was sharp, broken with urgency. The kind of bark that seemed to strike the truck door rather than the air. Tate frowned. "You hungry? Food's on the porch." Koda barked again, stepping closer to the front wheel. For a foolish second, Tate thought the dog meant to bite the tire. The old shepherd lowered his head and sniffed along the snow near the truck. His muzzle passed near the front undercarriage. He sneezed hard, backed away, then barked once more. Tate opened the door, one boot hitting the packed snow. The cold hit his bad knee. His head throbbed. The light was fading fast, and town was still miles away. He saw nothing wrong beneath the truck from where he stood. No leak spreading dark on snow. No dangling part. No broken line he could identify without crawling underneath. And crawling underneath on ice with a TB. Eye headache was one of the few forms of stupidity he still recognized. Koda stared at him. Tate tried a thin smile. "If you're warning me about old age, you're late." The dog whined then. A small sound. That gave Tate pause. He looked toward the canyon road, then back at the cabin. For a moment, the sensible thing hovered before him like a hand held out in darkness. "Stay. Call Wren. Check the footage again. Wait until morning." Then he saw the blue notice on the kitchen table in his mind. The hearing, the town, the file growing fat on every moment he looked helpless. "No," he said, too quietly for anyone but himself. "I'm not hiding in my own house." He climbed back into the truck. Koda barked until the engine noise swallowed him. Cold Fork looked almost kind under falling snow. The pharmacy clerk did not mention the hearing notice. That was how Tate knew everyone had heard. The clerk only spoke too carefully, as if Tate were a glass jar already cracked. At Harlan's grocery, he bought 3 cans of chicken soup, coffee, batteries for the trail cameras, and a small bag of dog food he pretended not to think about. He kept his list in one hand. He moved slowly. He did not drop anything. A victory no one would record. On the way out, Mrs. Jensen touched his sleeve. She was small and round, wrapped in a purple winter coat, her white hair tucked under a knitted hat. Her eyes flicked toward two men near the coffee machine before returning to him. "I told them about the coyote," she said softly, "that you helped." Tate swallowed. The words caught, came loose, caught again. "Thank you." She nodded once. "Some people hear what pays them best." It was not much. It was enough to keep him from feeling entirely buried. Night had fallen by the time Tate headed back toward the canyon. The road out of Cold Fork climbed through dark pine and limestone, following the old curves where the canyon narrowed. Snow drifted across the pavement in pale ribbons. The truck heater blew warm air at his boots. A paper bag of groceries shifted on the passenger seat whenever he took a turn. Tate kept both hands on the wheel. His headache had dulled. The medicine bottle clicked softly in the cup holder. Halfway up the grade, the truck picked up speed. Tate eased his foot onto the brake. The pedal sank too far. His stomach dropped before the truck did. He pressed harder. Nothing. Not soft brakes. Not bad brakes. No brakes. The road curved left along a drop into black timber and snow-filled rock below. Tate downshifted. The engine screamed. The rear tires slid sideways, caught, slid again. The headlights swung across trees, snow, stone, then empty air. "No," Tate said. The word came out clean. He pumped the brake. Useless. His training arrived before panic. Scan, choose, commit. There was no shoulder wide enough, no runaway lane, just ice, trees, and the canyon leaning open like a mouth. The truck struck the guardrail with a sound like a giant tearing sheet metal in half. For one breath, Tate saw everything with impossible clarity. The red flash of the warning light. The challenge coin swinging from his pocket cord. A pine trunk wearing snow. The grocery bag floating upward. Then the truck went over. It rolled once down the slope, hit rock, rolled again, and landed hard on its passenger side in a pocket of deep snow below the road. The world turned white, then black, then red. Tate came back to himself in pieces. Pain first, ribs, left leg, forehead, then sound, the tick of the engine, the hiss of something leaking, wind moving through broken glass. He hung awkwardly against the seatbelt, half twisted, his left boot pinned beneath the lower dash where metal had folded in. Blood ran warm down the side of his face, then cold when it reached his jaw. He tried to move. Pain took the air from him. For a while he only breathed. In, out. Small. The windshield was cracked into a white spiderweb. Beyond it, snow slid down in sheets from the dark. The road above was invisible. His phone lay somewhere below him, or above him. The truck's sideways position made the world difficult to name. He reached. His fingers brushed the edge of the device under the seat. The screen was cracked but lit when he pressed it. Emergency call. The line connected. A woman's voice cut through static. 911. What is your emergency? Tate tried to answer. See canyon. Truck. No. Static swallowed him. Sir? Can you repeat your location? He drew breath. The pain in his ribs stabbed white. Spearfish. Grade. Brakes. The phone slipped from his bloody fingers and fell into the snow packed through the broken window. The call stayed alive for a few seconds. Wind, metal ticking. Tate trying to breathe. Then, far above or far away, a dog barked. The line died. Snow began entering the cab through the broken side window. At the private kennel outside Cold Fork, Koda went mad. He had paced since dusk, refused food, scratched at the gate until the old boards shuddered. The woman who owned the kennel shouted for him to settle down, but Koda no longer belonged to human schedules. Some scent had burned through the night, sharp and wrong. Brake fluid, torn rubber, fear, and the man from the canyon. When the wind shifted, carrying the faintest trace of blood, the old training inside him woke fully. Not memory. Command. Find. Koda hit the gate with his shoulder. Once. Twice. The latch, rusted and poorly set, cracked loose. He forced his head through the gap, scraped his flank, and pushed into the snow. His back leg dragged for the first few strides. Then he ran. Not fast like a young dog, not graceful, but with a brutal purpose that made age irrelevant. He crossed the road behind the kennel, cut through a frozen drainage ditch, and took the tree line toward the canyon. Snow thickened. The wind slapped ice against his muzzle. Koda kept the scent low in his nose. At the canyon road, he found the place where tires had fought ice and lost. He found the torn guardrail. He found the hot metal smell of the truck below. He did not hesitate. The slope was steep. Snow hid rocks beneath it. Koda slid more than climbed, claws digging, body twisting to protect the bad hip. Near the bottom, he tumbled, struck his shoulder, rose with a grunt, and pushed on. The truck lay on its side like a dead animal. Koda reached the broken window and thrust his muzzle inside. Tate's eyes opened halfway. For one moment, man and dog stared at each other through glass dust and freezing air. "You," Tate breathed. Koda whined once, then began to work. He pawed snow away from the opening. He bit at the torn edge of Tate's coat and pulled. Tate groaned, tried to help, failed, then tried again. Pain made him curse. The dog did not care. He pulled when Tate stopped, waited when Tate gasped, pulled again. Inch by inch, Tate's upper body came free of the broken window and out of the cab's worst draft. His pinned leg remained trapped, but Koda cleared snow from around him, then shoved his body against Tate's chest and shoulder. The warmth was not enough. It was everything. Tate drifted. The canyon became water. The snow became black surf. He heard Jonah Vale laughing somewhere beyond a bulkhead that no longer existed. Then Koda's breath struck his face, hot and animal and stubborn. Tate opened his eyes. The old shepherd was pressed over him, trembling, his silver muzzle nearly touching Tate's cheek. Snow gathered over both of them. Koda's front paws were bleeding where he had dug through ice crust and broken glass. Tate lifted one hand by sheer insult to death. His fingers touched the faded red collar. "You came," he whispered. Koda made a low sound in his throat, not quite a whine, not quite an answer. Then he lifted his head toward the unseen road and barked. Again, again, each bark tore itself out of him and struck the canyon walls, climbing through snow and pine and darkness. Tate closed his hand around the collar. For the first time that night, he stopped trying to command his own survival. He let the old dog keep watch. Above them, the road disappeared under new snow. Below it, in the hidden pocket of the canyon, a wounded man and a discarded rescue dog held on beneath the storm, while Koda's voice rang through the night like a bell no one had yet come to answer. At 4:17 in the morning, Ren Sundström heard a deadline speak. She sat in the small EMS room behind Cold Fork's volunteer fire station, wrapped in her navy jacket, one hand around a paper cup of coffee that had given up being hot an hour ago. The storm had turned the windows white. Snow pressed against the glass in restless waves, and the fluorescent light above her desk hummed like a tired insect. The dispatcher had sent her the recording because the call had come from somewhere near Spearfish Canyon. A broken call. A man's voice, then static. Wren played it once and heard mostly wind. She played it again and leaned closer. "See canyon, truck. No!" Static chewed through the rest. Then a word, faint and fractured. "Brakes!" Wren stopped breathing for half a second. She played it a third time. This time, beneath the metal ticking and the storm, she heard something else. A dog. Not close to the phone, not clear. But there, rising through the broken seconds like a sound from another world. One bark, rough and urgent, cut off when the line died. Wren sat back slowly. Her mind went to Tate Calder in the grocery aisle, his pupils tracking her penlight, his voice catching, but his answers correct. It went to the way people had watched him as if they were waiting for him to prove the worst thing they had already decided. Then it went to the old German shepherd she had heard rumors about from the Jensen place, the stray near the canyon, the one with the silver muzzle and the red collar. The station radio cracked with weather chatter. No clear location, no confirmed wreck, road conditions dangerous. Wait for county plows. Wren looked at the clock. Waiting was sometimes medical care. Keeping a rescuer from becoming another victim mattered. She knew that. She had been trained to know that. She had repeated it to frightened families and reckless volunteers. But the bark in that recording did not sound like weather. It sounded like time running out. She grabbed her keys and drove to Doss Carver's house. Her grandfather was already awake. Doss sat beside the front window in a faded flannel shirt and wool socks, one hand resting on a chipped mug, his old face turned toward the dark. Snow moved beyond the glass, but his eyes were narrowed as if he could see through it. The kitchen smelled of coffee, motor oil, and wood smoke that had settled into the house over decades. "You heard it?" Wren asked before taking off her gloves. Doss did not look at her. "Dog's been barking up canyon for near an hour." "You sure it's not someone's yard dog?" He shook his head once. "Yard dog barks at shadows. That one's calling." Wren opened her phone and played the 911 recording. The man's broken voice filled the kitchen. Doss's jaw tightened. When the faint bark came through, his hand stilled around the mug. "Not barking at the moon," he said quietly. "Dogs calling people." Wren watched him stand. At 74, Doss moved like an old truck that had no business starting in winter, but did anyway out of pure offense. He pulled on his oil-stained blue work jacket, shoved a flashlight into one pocket, a coil of rope into another, and grabbed a thermos from the counter. "You're not coming," Wren said. "Roads up there know me better than they know you. You have a bad knee. So does half the county. Bring the med bag." She wanted to argue. Instead, she did what families in emergencies often did. She loved him by moving fast. The rescue pickup bucked against the storm as they climbed out of Cold Fork. Wren drove with both hands tight on the wheel, the tires searching for grip beneath packed snow. The headlights showed only what the blizzard allowed. A few yards of road, pine trunks flashing past, the white blur of wind. Doss sat beside her, silent except for directions. "Ease left here. Don't brake on this curve. Next quarter-mile, road gets mean." To anyone else, the canyon was a dark wall of snow and trees. To Doss, it was a machine with old habits. He knew where frost settled first, where runoff glazed the pavement, where sound carried up from a ravine and lied about its distance. Wren called dispatch twice. Search and rescue was assembling, but slowly. Plows were delayed behind a jackknifed truck south of town. A deputy was trying to reach the upper road from the other side. "Last ping puts the phone near the Spearfish grade," the dispatcher said through static. "That grade has 3 bad curves," Doss muttered. "Which one?" Wren asked. He lowered the window an inch. The cab filled with cold. At first she heard only wind. Then, faint and ragged, a bark rose from somewhere below the road. Doss pointed. "Third one." They found the guardrail by accident and instinct. A section of it had been torn outward, its metal twisted and shining raw beneath snow. Tire marks curved across the road, already filling in. Wren stopped the truck at an angle, hit the hazard lights, and grabbed the med bag. The bark came again. Closer now. Hoarse. Angry. Alive. Doss played his flashlight across the drop. The beam caught branches, rock, snow, then the dark shape of Tate's truck lying on its side far below. "Lord," Wren whispered. "Later," Doss said. "Rope first." The descent was ugly. Snow hid loose stones beneath its crust. Wren slipped twice, catching herself with one hand while the med bag slammed against her hip. Doss moved slower, but every step he chose held. He looped the rope around a pine and braced it with the quiet certainty of a man who had dragged cars out of ditches since before Wren was born. Halfway down, the German shepherd appeared from behind the wreck. For 1 second, Wren saw only teeth. The dog was enormous in the storm, fur clotted with snow, silver muzzle darkened by blood or ice, old red collar hanging crooked around his neck, his right ear folded at the tip. Both front paws were marked red where he had dug through glass and frozen crust. He stood over Tate, not beside him, over him. A wall of bone, fur, and oath. "Koda," Doss murmured, though Wren had never heard him say the name before. The dog growled. Wren stopped immediately. She knew enough about animals in rescue situations to respect the difference between aggression and guardianship. This dog was not attacking. He was refusing to surrender his wounded. "Tate," Wren called. "Mr. Calder, can you hear me?" A sound came from the snow beneath the dog. Not words, but not nothing. Wren slowly took off one glove. "Hey," Doss warned. "He needs to smell me." She crouched low, palm out, fingers relaxed despite the cold biting instantly into her skin. "I'm not taking him from you," she said to the dog. "I'm helping him live." The shepherd's growl stayed in his chest, his amber eyes fixed on her hand. Wren did not move closer. She did not coax too sweetly. She simply waited, kneeling in the snow while the storm soaked through her pants, and Tate's breathing rasped somewhere beneath the dog's body. Then Tate's hand shifted, barely. His fingers found the old red collar. "Koda," he breathed. The name was hardly a sound. The dog's ears moved. Wren looked at Doss. Doss looked at the dog. "So that's who you are," he said. Koda stepped back 1 pace, only 1. It was enough. Wren slid in beside Tate, her training taking over with a mercy colder than panic. Airway, breathing, bleeding, pulse, pupils. She spoke each finding aloud for Doss and for herself. Alive, hypothermic, head wound, possible rib fractures, left leg pinned or injured. He's conscious but altered. Tate's eyes opened a fraction. "Truck," he whispered. "We found you." "Brakes!" Wren froze for less than a heartbeat, then she kept working. "Save your breath." Doss had heard it too. His flashlight moved toward the wreck, but he said nothing yet. Together they stabilized Tate as much as the slope allowed. Wren wrapped him in emergency blankets and heat packs from the med bag. Koda hovered inches away, whining whenever Tate's breathing hitched. When Wren checked the dog's bleeding paws, Koda pulled back, then immediately pressed against Tate again. "You stubborn old thing," Wren said, and she was not sure whether she meant the dog or the man. By the time the rest of the rescue team arrived, dawn had begun to gray the canyon. The extraction took nearly an hour. Men in orange jackets, ropes, a backboard shouted directions swallowed by wind. Koda tried twice to follow Tate onto the board, and finally Doss had to grip the old collar and speak to him like a mechanic calming an engine about to throw a rod. "He's going up, boy. Not away. Up." Koda trembled under his hand. When they lifted Tate toward the road, Koda climbed after them despite his bleeding paws. No one tried to stop him a third time. At the clinic in Cold Fork, Tate disappeared behind double doors under bright lights. Koda planted himself in the hallway and refused to move. A nurse suggested animal control. Wren gave her one look, and the nurse suddenly remembered another task elsewhere. Doss stood at the coffee machine with snow melting off his cap and blood on one sleeve that was not his. He had watched the wreck long enough to see what bothered him. A truck could lose brakes from age. It could lose them from bad fluid, rust, neglect. But Tate's truck had been in Doss's shop 6 weeks ago. The lines had looked fine then. Across town, by mid-morning, Dane Whitlock was already talking. Not publicly this time. Not yet. He started in the diner, where news traveled faster than official statements and left fewer fingerprints. "Terrible thing," he told 3 men near the counter. "Just terrible. But this is exactly why the county had concerns. A man in his condition, driving canyon roads at night in a storm." He shook his head, performing sorrow like a hymn he knew by memory. Thank God no family was coming the other way. By noon, the story had changed shape. Tate had crashed because he was confused. Tate had no business driving. Tate had nearly killed someone who might have been on that road. The dog was brave, of course. But bravery did not erase the fact that Tate Calder was unsafe. Wren heard one version of it in the clinic hallway and nearly threw her paper coffee into a vending machine. Instead, she walked back to Tate's room. He was awake, barely. His head had been bandaged. Purple bruising had begun along one side of his face. Tubes and monitors made him look smaller than he was, which angered her in a way she did not know what to do with. Koda lay beneath the bed. Someone had cleaned his paws and wrapped them lightly. He looked ridiculous and noble at once, like a knight forced to wear mittens. Tate's hand hung over the side of the mattress. Koda's muzzle rested beneath it. "He won't leave," Wren said. Tate's eyes moved toward her. "Good," he whispered. That evening, when the clinic made it clear Tate could not return to his snowed-in cabin and had no family to take him in, Pastor Lon Eberly opened the church basement. Lon arrived wearing a moss-green sweater under a gray wool coat, his white beard neat, his knees not nearly as reliable as his smile. He had spent 40 years burying people, marrying people, feeding people, and learning that holiness often looked like soup served before a sermon. "I've got a cot, a heater, and a basement that smells only slightly of old hymnals and pancake breakfast," he told Wren. "Bring the dog too unless he objects to Presbyterians." "He may object to everyone," Wren said. Lon looked at Koda under the clinic bed. "Then he'll fit right in." By nightfall, Tate was settled in the church basement beneath a stack of donated quilts. Koda lay beside the cot, one wrapped paw stretched over Tate's boot. Lon brought soup in a steel thermos and set it on a folding table. Scripture says angels appear in many forms, Lon said. In Cold Fork, apparently they arrive with 4 paws and breath that could peel paint. Tate made a sound that might have been pain. It might have been laughter. That was enough for Lon. While Wren stayed with Tate, Doss went to the tow yard. The truck had been hauled behind Miller's repair, snow still packed in its broken frame. Doss brought a flashlight, his small folding mechanic's magnifier, and a silence that had sharpened into decision. He photographed the vehicle before touching anything: front, side, undercarriage. Then he slid beneath it on a creeper board, muttering when his old knee protested. The brake line near the front wheel was damaged, not burst, not rusted through, cut. Doss stared at it for a long time. The edge was too clean in one place, ragged in another where pressure had finished what the blade began. A careless cut, a deadly one. He took more photographs. Then he called Wren and told her to come witness what he was about to remove. When she arrived, her face still pale from the long day, he pointed the light. "Tell me what you see." Wren crouched. Her EMT eyes were used to blood, not machinery, but even she saw the wrongness of it. "That doesn't look worn." "No," Doss said. "It doesn't." He removed the damaged section and sealed it in a plastic evidence bag he had once used for small carburetor parts. It was not perfect police procedure, and he knew it. But it was better than leaving the line where a helpful hand might make it disappear. "Who do we call?" Wren asked. Doss did not answer immediately. Cold Fork had a sheriff, yes. Cold Fork also had Dane Whitlock's money in half its pockets. Finally, Doss said, "Nora Keene." Deputy Nora Keene arrived at the tow yard 20 minutes later in a black patrol jacket dusted with snow. She was 35, straight-backed, with dark hair tied low and a small scar at her upper lip that made her serious face look even more final. She listened more than she spoke. Doss showed her the photographs. Wren explained Tate's condition, the 911 call, the word brakes. Nora took the bagged brake line without changing expression, but something changed behind her eyes. "I'll log it," she said. Doss looked at her. "Properly?" Nora held his gaze. For a moment, she was not a deputy standing in a tow yard. She was a daughter remembering her father, a Vietnam veteran half the county had called unstable because grief had made him hard to sit beside. By the time people understood he had needed help, he was already in the ground. "Properly," she said. Back in the church basement, Tate slept under the yellow glow of old fluorescent lights. The storm muttered against the foundation windows. Upstairs, someone had left the sanctuary lamp burning, a small red light in the dark nave like a heart refusing to quit. Koda opened his eyes when Nora entered with Wren and Doss. He did not growl. He simply watched. Nora stood at the foot of the cot and looked at Tate's bruised face, then at the dog's bandaged paws, then at the old collar faded almost brown with years. "No more rumors," she said quietly. "From here on, we use evidence." Tate did not wake, but his hand, resting near the edge of the cot, shifted in sleep until his fingers touched Koda's fur. The dog exhaled and laid his head down. Outside, Cold Fork still belonged to whispers. For that night, beneath the church, the truth had found a warm room. Tate Calder learned that healing was not a straight road. It was a staircase in the dark. Some mornings, he could sit up on the cot in the church basement without the room pitching sideways. Other mornings, Pain woke before he did, waiting in his ribs like a fist. His left leg throbbed beneath the blankets. The bandage above his brow itched. His headaches came and went with no respect for clocks, prayers, or the fact that Pastor Lon Eberly made coffee strong enough to raise lesser men from graves. The basement smelled of old hymnals, floor wax, soup, and wet dog. Tate had once slept in submarines, desert tents, cargo planes, and places where every shadow had teeth. Yet it was this church basement, with its folding tables stacked along one wall and children's Sunday school drawings taped crookedly near the stairs, that made him feel most exposed. Not unsafe, seen. That was worse in some ways. People came and went quietly. Wren checked his vitals. Lon brought food. Doss appeared with tools in his coat pocket, even when there was nothing to fix. Nora stopped by once, asked 2 questions, then listened to the answers as if Tate's words were not broken just because they came slowly. And Koda stayed. The old German shepherd had claimed the space beneath Tate's cot, as if the county had deeded it to him personally. His front paws were wrapped in clean bandages that made him look half heroic, half ridiculous. Every few hours, he rose stiffly, inspected the basement, sniffed the door, then returned to Tate's side with the solemn exhaustion of a guard who considered sleep a moral weakness. He did not fawn over Tate. That mattered. He did not stare with pity. He did not soften his eyes in the human way that said, "Poor thing, poor broken thing." Koda simply remained, breathing, watching, guarding. To the dog, Tate was not a drunk, not a competency case, not a file thickening on a county desk. He was a man who needed watching through the night. There was dignity in that, a strange, animal dignity Tate had not known he needed. On the 3rd day after the crash, Wren knelt beside Koda with a small scanner in her hand. "Don't look at me like that," she told the dog. Koda looked at her exactly like that. "I need your records. You have stitches on one paw, a possible hip issue, and the personality of a retired judge who disapproves of everyone's paperwork." From the cot, Tate made a sound that might have been a laugh if his ribs had been less cruel. Wren passed the scanner over the faded red collar first, then over the thick fur between Koda's shoulders. The device beeped. Koda flinched, but did not move away. Wren read the number on the screen, typed it into her tablet, and waited for the database to load. The basement heater clicked. Lon's footsteps moved somewhere overhead. Then the result appeared. Wren's expression changed so slightly that Tate might have missed it if he had not spent years reading faces in bad rooms. "What?" "Chutao," he asked. She did not answer at once. Her thumb scrolled down. "Koda isn't registered to a private owner," she said. Doss, who had been pretending to adjust a loose screw on a folding chair, looked over. Wren read from the screen. "Lawrence County Winter Search and Rescue K9 Unit." The words landed quietly. Then they stayed. Tate shifted against the pillow. "County?" Wren nodded. "Not just county. He was active duty, search dog, winter rescue, canyon recovery." Doss came closer, slowly now. "I knew that collar looked familiar," he murmured. Koda had lowered his head onto his paws. His amber eyes watched the humans with weary patience, as if they had finally reached a page he had been waiting years for them to read. Wren scrolled again. "Transferred to private kennel care after retirement," she said, "but the date is odd." "How odd?" Doss asked. "Edited odd." Tate felt the air in the basement tighten. Wren turned the tablet toward them. "The system shows a transfer date from 5 years ago, but there's an older note under it. Different formatting, different office code. It looks like someone changed the record later. Doss's face had gone still. Not blank, still. The way old men looked when a memory came walking up the road with its hat pulled low. "What do you remember?" Wren asked him. Doss rubbed one thumb along the cracked skin of his knuckle. "There was a slide," he said. "Old Whitlock Pit, early March, bad thaw, then a freeze, one worker missing. County search went out." "Koda was there?" Wren asked. Doss looked at the dog. Everybody knew Koda back then. He found a snowmobiler under a drift off Iron Creek. Found a boy who wandered from a campsite near Savoy. Folks called him the Canyon's Nose. Koda blinked slowly. Tate listened, one hand resting near the dog's shoulder. "What happened at the pit?" he asked. Doss hesitated. The basement seemed to listen with him. "That dog led them toward a service road Dane said didn't matter," Doss said. "Private access," he called it. "Unsafe." He had commissioners, deputies, everybody standing around in hard hats pretending danger had manners. Search got called off too soon. "Was the worker found?" Wren asked. "Spring thaw," Doss said. "Downstream. Weeks later." No one spoke. Above them, a floorboard creaked in the church. Doss continued, lower now. "After that, Koda disappeared from the unit. I heard he got retired because of age. Didn't think much on it." His eyes moved to Tate's bruised face. "Seems I made a habit of not thinking much." Wren reached out and squeezed his shoulder. Doss did not lean into it, but he did not move away. That afternoon, Nora Keene arrived with a legal pad, her patrol jacket dusted with snow and her expression locked behind duty. She stood near the furnace while Wren showed her the microchip record. Nora did not rush. She wrote down the chip number, the original registry, the altered transfer date, the office code. "Can you access the old county records?" Wren asked. "Some," Nora said. "The rest I'll have to request through channels." Doss gave a dry laugh. "Channels around here run through Whitlock's office." Nora's eyes lifted. "Then I'll dig beside the channel." It was the first time Tate saw steel beneath her caution. The next 2 days brought paper, not the kind Whitlock used like a net. This paper came in copies, scans, screenshots, old incident summaries, search reports pulled from boxes where dust had done its best to bury shame. Nora worked quietly. Wren helped where medical records met rescue logs. Doss remembered names, dates, roads, weather. Lon supplied coffee, and once, without being asked, a plate of oatmeal cookies shaped like bells from a church fundraiser no one wanted to admit were excellent. Piece by piece, the past began to look less like confusion and more like design. A search report from the old quarry slide had 3 pages missing. The K9 unit transfer form had been amended 2 months after the original entry. The officer field on one document had initials no one in rescue recognized, and the final approval stamp came from a county administrative office under Dane Whitlock's authority. None of it was enough. That was the maddening part. Enough to smell rot. Not enough to name the corpse. Nora said so plainly. Records irregularities don't prove sabotage. They don't prove Whitlock cut your brakes. They don't even prove he knew about the altered transfer. Tate nodded. He appreciated the truth, even when it disappointed him. Truth doesn't get stronger because we want it to, Nora added. Lon, standing by the coffee pot, raised one finger. A deeply irritating principle, but scripturally adjacent. Koda sneezed. Wren laughed before she could stop herself. For one bright second, the basement became almost ordinary. Then the phone rang upstairs, and the old world returned. Later that afternoon, Wren and Doss drove to Tate's cabin to collect the trail camera cards before anyone else thought to do the same. The canyon had changed since the crash. Snow softened the road shoulders and hid the violence beneath clean white layers. At Tate's driveway, Wren parked behind the cabin, careful not to disturb tracks near the woodpile. Inside, the cabin was cold. Doss moved through it with the awkward respect of a man entering another man's loneliness. The navy sweater still hung over the back of a chair. The unopened county envelope lay on the table. A tin pan sat washed near the sink for a dog that had never been invited in, but had somehow become part of the house. Wren saw Tate everywhere, not in clutter. There was little of that. In restraint, one plate, one mug, firewood stacked by size, medications lined in a row, a notebook on the table with dates and observations written in a drifting hand. North gate lock tampered, tire tracks, gray pickup, dog at tree line. She touched the page lightly. Doss stood beside her. "He was trying," she said. "Most men are," Doss answered. "World just likes judging the parts that show." They gathered the memory cards from the cameras and returned to the church before dark. Nora loaded the footage on Lon's old projector because the laptop screen was too small and because Lon claimed the projector needed one last noble mission before retirement. The image shone against a white sheet pinned to the basement wall. Snow, wind, empty driveway, then headlights. The gray pickup rolled into frame. The room went still. The driver stepped out. The face was unclear. The plates were unreadable under crusted salt, but the body was not hard to read. Big, heavy shoulders, work coat. The man moved toward Tate's truck and crouched beside the front wheel. Doss muttered one word: "Rusk." Nora did not look away from the screen. At the edge of the frame, Koda appeared. His body was rigid, head low, teeth visible even in black and white grain. He barked without sound, again and again, until the man beside the truck jerked upright and retreated toward the pickup. The clip ended. No one moved. Then Tate's hand slid down from the cot and rested on Koda's back. The dog did not lift his head. He already knew what he had done. Nora copied the file twice, sealed the card, and said she would send the brake line and footage to the state lab for independent review. "That won't be fast," she warned. "Fast has not been our friend," Lon said. That evening, after everyone had gone upstairs or home, Tate sat awake in the cot, watching Koda sleep. "You were barking before I knew," he said. Koda's ear twitched. "Story of my life," Tate whispered. "Somebody else always sees the blast coming." The dog opened one eye. Tate's throat tightened, but not from injury. He placed his fingers on the old red collar. The metal tag was scratched almost smooth. Under the basement light, he could finally make out faint letters. LC-SARK9. Lawrence County Search and Rescue. Not stray, not useless, not discarded by God, just erased by men. Upstairs, Pastor Lon opened the church door to a woman who had stood outside for nearly 5 minutes before knocking. Eloise Madsen wore a plum-colored cardigan under her winter coat, with a beige scarf pulled close around her throat. Her hair, brown threaded with silver, had been pinned too carefully, the way people dress when they are trying not to fall apart. She carried a small tin box in both hands. Lon had known Eloise for years. She worked at the county office, sat in the third pew on Christmas Eve, brought lemon bars to funerals, and left before anyone thanked her. Tonight she looked like a person being followed by every paper she had ever stamped. I need to give you something, she said. Lon stepped aside. Eloise entered the church, but she would not go down to the basement. I can't face him, she whispered. Tate? Her eyes filled. The dog. Lon said nothing. That mercy undid her more than questioning would have. She set the tin box on a table near the sanctuary entrance and opened it with shaking hands. Inside were folded copies, a thumb drive, and an old county stamp wrapped in cloth. There are permits, she said. Old ones, new ones. One that isn't what it says it is. And the K-9 transfer. Lon's expression lost its softness. Eloise. I stamped what Dane told me to stamp. Her voice broke, then steadied in a smaller shape. I told myself it was paperwork. Dogs retire, men get old, land gets sold. That's what I told myself. From below, faintly, Koda gave one low bark in his sleep. Eloise flinched. Lon closed the box. I'll call Deputy Keene. She nodded quickly. Don't tell anyone I came, not yet. Courage often starts anonymously, Lon said. But it rarely gets to stay that way forever. Eloise wiped her face with one gloved hand and left through the side door. Lon stood alone in the church entry. The tin box in his hands, feeling heavier than metal had any right to feel. Across town, Rusk Harlan sat in his pickup outside Whitlock Aggregate, staring at a photograph someone had shown around the yard. Tate Calder on a stretcher, blood on his face. The dog beside him, paws wrapped, eyes half closed with exhaustion. Rusk had seen men hurt before. Mines did that. Machines did that. Bad roads did that. But this was different. He had put the blade to the line. He had told himself it was a scare. Now the man in the photograph looked half dead, and the old dog looked like it had crawled out of a war to keep him from crossing the final border. Rusk's phone buzzed. Whitlock. He answered. Keep your mouth shut, Dane said without greeting. Rusk stared at the photograph. Deputies asking about the truck. Then you don't know anything. They got the brake line. A pause. When Dane spoke again, his voice was colder. Listen to me carefully. You did what you were told to do, nothing more. If you start inventing guilt, you'll carry it alone. The call ended. Rusk sat in the dark, the phone still pressed to his ear. For the first time since he had taken Whitlock's money, he understood the shape of the thing he had become part of. It was not intimidation. It was not politics. It was not business. It was a man in the snow, bleeding beneath a truck, while a dog barked his throat raw, trying to undo what a blade had done. Rusk lowered the phone. Outside, snow fell over the gravel yard, covering tire tracks, rusted equipment, and every dirty thing men hoped winter would hide. Dane Whitlock had chosen the county hearing room because he trusted rooms more than people. People could hesitate. People could feel guilty. People could look at a wounded man and remember their own fathers, sons, or buried mistakes. Rooms were easier. This one had served him well for years. It sat on the second floor of the Lawrence County building, with tall windows looking over a street packed with dirty winter snow. A long wooden table stood at the front beneath the county seal. The American flag leaned in the corner. Rows of public chairs faced forward like church pews without mercy. The microphone at the commissioner's table had a loose wire that hummed if a speaker got too close. Whitlock knew that hum. He knew which chair gave him the best angle toward the public. He knew where to stand so the morning light touched his camel coat and made him appear warmer than he was. By 9 o'clock, Cold Fork had crowded into the room. Not everyone, but enough. Farmers in insulated coats. Store clerks, 2 men from the diner, Mrs. Jensen with her purple coat buttoned to her throat, a reporter from the local paper, a few county employees who pretended they were there for work, and at the back, near the side aisle, 2 state investigators stood quietly in plain, dark coats. Whitlock noticed them. He did not like it, but he smiled anyway. Tate Calder entered with Wren on one side and Koda on the other. The room changed, though no one spoke. Tate moved slowly on a cane, his left leg stiff, one side of his face still yellowed with fading bruises. The bandage was gone from his brow, but the cut had left a red line near the old scar at his temple. His tobacco-brown canvas jacket hung looser on him than it had before the crash. Pain had carved weight from him. Koda walked close enough that his shoulder brushed Tate's knee every few steps. The old German shepherd's front paws were no longer wrapped, but the fur there remained rough and shaved in small patches. His faded red rescue collar had been cleaned. Under the hearing room lights, the tag showed its worn letters more clearly than before. LC-SARK9. A murmur passed through the room. Someone whispered, "That's the dog." Tate heard it. He kept walking. Whitlock rose before anyone else could speak. "Mr. Calder," he said, voice rich with public concern, "we appreciate you being here, especially after such a frightening accident." Koda stopped. His head turned toward Whitlock. The dog did not growl. He did not need to. Whitlock's smile tightened by a fraction. The hearing officer, a thin woman from outside the county named Judith Vale, adjusted her glasses and called the meeting to order. She was not part of Whitlock's usual circle, which had irritated him when the assignment came through. Still, he had assumed the file would do its work. Files often did. Mara Whitlock Pike sat at the side table with the social services packet in front of her. Her pale gray coat was folded over the chair back, but she still wore her blue scarf as if cold had entered her bones. The folder she had carried for weeks now seemed too heavy for her hands. She did not look at Tate when his name was read. Whitlock opened with practiced sorrow. "No one in this room wants to strip Mr. Calder of dignity," he said, "but dignity does not mean abandonment. We have a decorated veteran living alone in an isolated canyon, suffering neurological symptoms, involved in multiple concerning incidents, and now a serious crash that could have cost lives." His silver pen rested between his fingers. He tapped it once. "We are here to ask whether protective oversight is necessary before tragedy becomes irreversible." A few heads nodded. Tate looked at those heads and felt something inside him go very still. Wren had warned him this would happen. They would not call him useless. They would call him vulnerable. They would not say, "We want your land." They would say, "We want you safe." That kind of blade left a cleaner wound. Mara was asked to summarize the file. She stood. Her voice began steady, trained by years of reading case notes, but it thinned as she went on. Reports of disorientation, reports of firearm discharge, reports of wandering, reports of unstable behavior in a public store, potential inability to maintain property safely. She read each line as if hoping the paper would protect her from the man sitting 10 feet away. Then Mrs. Jensen raised her hand from the third row. Judith Vale looked up. "Ma'am, there will be time for public comment." "I'm sorry," Mrs. Jensen said, standing anyway. Her voice shook, but her chin did not. "That firearm report. He fired to scare off a coyote from my coop. I was the one he helped." The room shifted. Mara's eyes went to the paper. Whitlock's pen stopped tapping. Judith Vale made a note. "Thank you," she said. "We'll return to that." It was a small thing, only one sentence. But Tate felt it land beside him like the first stone of a bridge. Then came the witnesses Whitlock had expected to help him. A clerk from the grocery spoke of Tate staring too long at shelves. A man from the diner said Tate seemed off and could snap someday. Another claimed he had seen Tate walking near the canyon road at night, though under questioning he could not name the date. Each word was soft. Together they tried to become a wall. Tate was asked if he wished to respond. He stood too quickly, and pain flared up his side. Koda stepped closer. Tate put one hand on the table. "Yes," he said. The microphone hummed. His throat tightened. "I have a brain injury. I know that. I have bad days. I have—" The word he wanted vanished. Not forgotten. Blocked. He could see it. Feel its shape. It would not come. Several people lowered their eyes. Whitlock watched with the calm hunger of a man seeing a trap close. Tate tried again. "I have symptoms, not drunkenness, not madness." The last word came out rough. He hated that it sounded like pleading. His thumb searched for the challenge coin in his pocket. The burned edge pressed into his skin. Jonah Vale's coin. Jonah, who had died before the world, could make him explain the blast. Tate closed his fist. Then, instead of forcing another sentence, he sat down. Wren stood. She did not rush to rescue his pride. She let the room sit with what it had just seen. A man struggling to speak, not a man without thought. "I'm Wren Sundstrom," she said. "Emergency medical technician. I treated Mr. Calder after the crash and evaluated him previously during an incident at Harlan's grocery." Her voice held steady. Not warm, not cold. Clinical enough to cut through gossip. She explained traumatic brain injury in plain terms, balance issues, speech disruption under stress, headaches, the difference between neurological symptoms and intoxication. "At the grocery," she said, "Mr. Calder was oriented to person, place, and date. He followed neurological tracking. He showed no signs consistent with alcohol impairment." Whitlock leaned toward his microphone. "Miss Sundstrom, you are not a neurologist." "No," Wren said. "I'm the person in this room who checked him before deciding what to believe." Silence followed. Not loud silence, useful silence. Wren continued. She described the crash scene without dramatics. Hypothermia risk, head injury, possible rib fractures, a pinned leg, a dog using body heat to keep him alive. "Koda did not make Mr. Calder unsafe," she said. "Koda is the reason he lived long enough for us to debate his safety." Koda's ears lifted at his name. A few people looked away. Doss Carver came next. He carried no speech, only a manila envelope and the sort of patience that made people nervous. He set photographs on the table one by one. The truck, the undercarriage, the damaged brake line, the sealed evidence receipt from Deputy Keene, the preliminary report from the state vehicle examiner. Doss adjusted his old cap in his hands. "I've fixed trucks in this county 48 years, he said. "Rust has a way of talking. Wear has a way of talking. This line didn't wear out." Judith Vale leaned forward. "Mr. Carver, what is your opinion?" Doss pointed to the enlarged photograph. "That cut started with a blade. Pressure finished it. Winter didn't do that. Age didn't do that. A man did." The room stirred. Whitlock smiled thinly. "A mechanic's opinion is not proof of intent." Deputy Nora Keene stood before Judith Vale could respond. "No," Nora said. "But the state examiner's report supports his conclusion." Whitlock turned toward her. For the first time that morning, irritation crossed his face before he could smooth it. Nora laid out the chain of evidence. The 911 call in which Tate said, "Brakes," The damaged line, the photographs taken before removal, the sealed transfer, the independent review. Then she introduced the trail camera footage. Lon Eberly, seated near the wall, closed his eyes for half a second as the projector hummed to life. Perhaps it was a prayer. Perhaps he was begging old technology not to humiliate him. The white screen lit. Snow. Darkness. A gray pickup. The room grew so still that the projector fan sounded like wind under a door. The figure stepped out. Large shoulders, work coat, salt-crusted plates. A face half turned away. He moved toward Tate's truck, crouched by the front wheel. At the edge of the frame, Koda appeared, silent on film, but unmistakable in fury. The dog barked at the man until he backed away. Then the clip ended. Rusk Harlan sat 3 rows from the back. His face had gone gray. Whitlock did not look at him. "That proves nothing," Whitlock said. "A man near a truck. A dog barking. This is theater." Nora's jaw tightened. "Then let's leave theater and discuss records." She brought out Koda's microchip registry. Lawrence County Winter Search and Rescue K-9 Unit. Altered transfer date. Missing pages in a quarry slide report. Administrative approval codes linked to Whitlock's office. Whitlock laughed once, softly. "Are we here to evaluate Mr. Calder or discuss a retired dog's paperwork?" Judith Vale looked at him over her glasses. "Today, Commissioner, we appear to be discussing whether the concerns in this file were raised in good faith." That was the first moment Whitlock realized the room was no longer behaving like his room. Then Eloise Madsen stood. She did not stand bravely at first. She gripped the chair in front of her with both hands, plum cardigan visible beneath her coat, face pale, eyes fixed on the floor. Lon turned in his seat, surprise and sorrow crossing his face together. "I have something to say," Eloise whispered. Judith Vale motioned her forward. Eloise walked like each step had to be negotiated with fear. At the front, she placed a small tin box on the table. The sound it made was gentle, almost ridiculous, considering what it held. "I worked in the county office 31 years, she said. "I stamped permits, filed transfers, corrected dates when supervisors told me dates had been entered wrong." Her hands shook as she opened the box. Inside were copies, an old stamp, and a thumb drive. "I corrected the K-9 transfer record," she said. "It was not an error. I was told to change it." Whitlock stood. "This is absurd." Eloise flinched but did not sit. "I also copied a mining access permit after I realized the signature page had been replaced." Her voice broke, then hardened in a small, surprising way. "The land in question borders a protected drainage area. The gravel seam Mr. Whitlock wants cannot be legally accessed the way he has represented." The room erupted. Judith Vale struck the gavel twice. Whitlock's face flushed dark. "You bitter old woman," he snapped. "You have no idea what you're saying." Eloise turned toward him. For the first time, she looked him in the eye. "I know exactly what I stamped." From the back row, Rusk Harlan stood so suddenly his chair scraped the floor. Everyone turned. Rusk looked like a man who had not slept for days. His big hands opened and closed at his sides. A state investigator moved slightly, watching him. Whitlock's voice dropped. "Sit down, Rusk." Rusk did not. "I cut the line," he said. The words were not loud. They were heavy. A woman gasped. Rusk stared at the floor. "He told me to make something happen, enough to help the file, enough to scare folks into thinking Calder couldn't be out there alone." Whitlock pointed at him. "He's lying to save himself." Rusk lifted his head. I didn't think it would near kill him. That is not my responsibility, Whitlock said sharply. The room went silent. Too silent. Whitlock heard what he had said after he said it. Nora turned toward him. Judith Vale's pen stopped moving. Tate sat very still, Koda's shoulder pressed against his leg. Whitlock tried to recover. I cannot be responsible for every action of an employee acting independently. But the Polish had cracked, and beneath it, something ugly had shown its teeth. Then he made the mistake that men like him often make when control begins to leave their hands. He looked at Tate. Not at Judith Vale, not at Nora, at Tate. All of this for what? Whitlock said, voice rising. A damaged old war relic sitting on land this county needs? Progress should not be held hostage by a broken man and a dog nobody wanted. No one moved. Even the room seemed to stop breathing. Tate's face did not change, but his hand lowered to Koda's head. The dog stood. One low sound rolled from his chest. Nora stepped forward with one of the state investigators. Dane Whitlock, she said. You're being detained pending investigation for conspiracy, evidence tampering, obstruction, and involvement in vehicle sabotage. Whitlock stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. You can't do this here. Nora's voice did not rise. That's the thing about rooms, Commissioner. They don't belong to you. The cuffs closed around his wrists. There was no applause, only the metallic click. Only a long breath moving through the public chairs, as if the whole town had been holding it for years. Mara Pike had begun to cry silently at the side table. She looked at Tate, then away, unable yet to ask forgiveness from the man whose life she had reduced to forms. Eloise sat down before her knees gave out. Lon placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. Rusk was led aside by the state investigator, pale and shaking, no longer a threat in anyone's eyes, just a coward whose guilt had finally outrun fear. Whitlock, still furious, was walked past Tate. For 1 second, their eyes met. Tate could have said many things. He could have cursed him, could have named Jonah, the crash, the snow, the humiliation, the way a man's life could be placed under glass and mislabeled for profit. Instead, he looked down at Koda. The old German shepherd stood beside him, silver muzzle lifted, amber eyes fixed forward, the faded red collar bright against his fur. Tate placed his palm on the dog's head. Good, he said. The word came clean. Then, after a pause, he added softly, Boy. Koda gave one short bark, not wild, not triumphant, just final. In that room, beneath the county seal and the flag and the buzzing microphone, Cold Fork saw what it had nearly helped destroy. Not a drunk, not a madman, not a file, a man. And beside him, a dog whose name men had tried to erase, standing like a living oath that truth, once dug from the snow, still knew how to bite. Cold Fork did not become kind overnight. Truth had entered the county hearing room like a storm breaking through a locked door, but storms did not rebuild what they broke. They only showed what had been rotten, what had been buried, what had been standing too long without repair. For several days after Dane Whitlock was led away in handcuffs, the town moved carefully around Tate Calder's name. People lowered their voices when he came up. Some crossed the street rather than face the memory of what they had said. Others spoke too loudly, too warmly, as if volume could erase cowardice. At Harlan's grocery, the young clerk who had once watched Tate buy trail cameras with suspicion now placed a bag of coffee on the counter and mumbled, No charge. Tate looked at the bag, then at the clerk. I can pay. I know, the boy said, eyes fixed on the register. Just don't. Tate paid anyway. Not because he was angry. Because pity and apology both had a way of becoming another hand on a man's shoulder, guiding him where he had not agreed to go. Outside the grocery, Mrs. Jensen waited with her purple coat buttoned crookedly and a paper sack of biscuits in her arms. "For the dog," she said. Tate accepted them. Koda, sitting beside Tate's bad leg, sniffed the bag with grave interest. "They're homemade," Mrs. Jensen added. "No raisins, I asked Wren." "Thank you," Tate said. The words came clean. Mrs. Jensen smiled a little, then looked past him toward the street where people pretended not to watch. "I should have spoken sooner," she said. Tate did not absolve her. He only nodded. That was all he had to give. It was more than nothing. The county moved slowly, but this time the slowness did not belong entirely to corruption. Whitlock Aggregate was suspended from county contracts pending investigation. State officials began examining the altered permits and the protected drainage near the gravel seam. The old quarry slide was reopened as a records case. Rusk Harlan remained under formal questioning. Eloise Madsen gave a sworn statement, then went home and slept for 14 hours with her shoes still on. The competency petition against Tate was withdrawn. No one said the word victory, not around him. Victory sounded too clean for a thing that had nearly cost him his life. At the church basement, Tate read the withdrawal notice twice, then a third time. Mara Whitlock Pike came the next afternoon. She arrived without her gray coat, without the blue folder she used to carry like a shield. She stood at the foot of the stairs while Pastor Lon asked if she wanted coffee. Mara shook her head. Her face looked smaller than before, as if a week of truth had removed years of borrowed certainty. Tate sat on the cot, one hand resting on his cane. Koda stood between them, not growling, just present. Mara's eyes moved to the dog and filled with shame so quickly she had to look at the floor. "I withdrew my recommendation," she said, "and I asked to be removed from any future case involving you." Tate waited. Mara swallowed. "I told myself I was helping. I told myself the file was enough. I told myself a lot of things because they were easier than knocking on your door." Her hands twisted together. "I'm sorry, Mr. Calder." The room held its breath in a quiet way. Lon did not interrupt. Wren, standing near the coffee table, did not rescue either of them. Tate looked at Mara for a long time. He thought of the blue envelope, the grocery aisle, the way paper could turn a life into a cage while the people holding the keys called it care. Forgiveness stood somewhere in the distance. He could see it. He was not ready to walk there just because someone else had arrived tired. "When you try to save somebody," he said slowly, "ask if they're tied up first." Mara blinked. Tate's voice caught on the next words, but he forced them through. "Mercy with no truth is just another rope." Mara nodded once. A tear slipped down her cheek. "I'll remember that." Koda stepped forward and sniffed her sleeve. Mara froze. The old shepherd sneezed, apparently unimpressed with county remorse. Lon coughed into one fist to hide a laugh. For the first time since the hearing, Tate smiled without pain reaching it first. A week later, Doss Carver rebuilt the truck's brake system. The truck itself looked like it had wrestled the canyon and lost, but the frame was salvageable. Doss worked in his garage with the overhead heater clanking above him and a radio playing old country songs too quietly to admit affection. Tate sat on a stool nearby, cane against his knee, watching Doss replace lines, fittings, fluid, trust. For a long while, neither man spoke. That was how old men sometimes forgave each other for being alive in the same room. Finally, Doss said, "I heard people call you drunk." Tate looked at him. Doss kept his eyes on the brake line. More than once. The wrench clicked. I knew better. Tate's hand tightened around the cane. Doss continued, "Didn't say so." Outside, snow slid from the garage roof in a soft sheet and broke apart on the ground. "I was tired," Doss said. "Didn't want trouble, figured a man's reputation was his own fight." He glanced up then. That was a coward's excuse. Tate studied him. Doss looked older than he had in the canyon, maybe because guilt aged a man faster when it finally stood up straight. "I pushed people off," Tate said. The words came slowly, but Doss waited. "Didn't want them seeing me fall." Doss snorted. "Everybody falls. Some of us just do it with witnesses and insurance forms." Tate let out a short laugh, then winced at his ribs. "Don't make me laugh." "Wasn't trying to." "Yes, you were." Doss tightened the final fitting. "Maybe a little." They stood side by side then, looking at the truck, listening to the heater tick and the meltwater drip from the eaves. They did not shake hands, did not hug, did not make speeches about brotherhood or second chances. Doss handed Tate the keys. Tate took them. That was their altar call. By late March, the church basement no longer needed to be Tate's refuge. The road to his cabin had been cleared, the porch rail repaired. Someone had stacked firewood beside the door while he was still at the church. No note, no name. Tate did not ask. Some apologies were more honest when they did not demand a witness. Wren drove him home the first time, with Koda in the back seat pretending not to enjoy the ride. The canyon looked different under thaw. Snow still clung to shaded slopes, but water ran beneath the ice, speaking in quick silver voices. The pines seemed taller now that they were no longer bent beneath storm weight. At the cabin, Koda stepped out first. He moved stiffly, sniffed the porch, inspected the steps, circled the woodpile, and finally stood at the door as if judging whether the house had behaved in his absence. "Well?" Tate asked. Koda looked at him, then sneezed. Wren said, "That means it passes inspection." "High praise," Tate said. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold ash and cedar. One mug waited by the sink, one plate in the cabinet, one chair pulled slightly from the table. For years, the singularity of those things had comforted Tate. Now it struck him as a kind of sentence. Wren helped him settle, checked his bandage, left a list of exercises on the table, and pretended not to notice when he grimaced at the word exercises. "Do them," she said. "You boss everybody?" "Yes." "Successful?" "Mixed results." Koda leaned against Tate's leg. Wren pointed at the dog. "He'll tell me if you don't." Tate looked down. "Traitor." Koda yawned. When Wren left, the cabin grew quiet. Not empty, quiet. There was a difference now. 2 weeks later, Pastor Lon came up the canyon with a thermos, a clipboard, and the dangerous look of a man carrying an idea. "No," Tate said before Lon reached the porch. Lon stopped with one boot on the lower step. "You haven't heard the question." "I know your face." "That is unfortunate. I was hoping it looked pastoral." "It looks like work." Lon smiled. "There are younger veterans in the county. Some don't come to church. Some don't go to clinics. Some sit in trucks outside buildings and drive away before anyone opens the door." Tate looked past him toward the trees. "I'm not a counselor. No, not a preacher. Mercifully." Tate frowned. Lon lifted both hands. "I mean that with love." Koda came to the doorway and sat beside Tate, amber eyes moving between the two men as if moderating. Lon's voice softened. You don't need to fix them. Maybe just let them sit where they don't have to explain the weather in their heads. Tate's throat tightened. I can't always talk. Then you'll be the first man in Cold Fork to prove silence can still welcome somebody. The answer should have been no. Tate had earned solitude. He had defended it. He had built walls out of routine and weather, and for a long time those walls had kept him standing. But Koda leaned against his knee, warm and heavy and real. The old dog had not waited for Tate to become whole before saving him. Perhaps that was the lesson. A man did not have to be healed to keep a light on. The first veteran arrived on a Thursday near sundown. He was young, maybe 28, with a buzz cut growing out badly and hands that trembled when he thought no one was watching. His name was Eli Boone. He did not knock. He sat on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees, staring into the trees as if the road behind him might accuse him of coming. Tate saw him through the window. He nearly let the silence handle it. Then Koda rose. The shepherd walked to the door, looked back once, and waited. Tate opened it. The young man did not turn. Pastor said I could come up here, Eli muttered. He talks too much, Tate said. That earned half a smile. Koda stepped onto the porch, sniffed Eli's sleeve, then placed his silver muzzle on the young man's knee. Eli's hands stopped shaking, not because the pain left, because something warm had noticed it without asking for a report. Tate leaned against the door frame, feeling the old ache in his ribs and the familiar catch in his speech. You want coffee? He asked. Eli looked up. Yeah, he said, if that's okay. Tate glanced at Koda. The dog did not move. Apparently, Tate said, the committee approves. They sat in the cabin until dark. They did not talk much. That was all right. By April, the paperwork came through. Koda was no longer listed as county property, retired asset, transfer case, or administrative file. Wren drove the forms up herself, grinning like she had stolen something holy from bureaucracy. Tate read the new registration slowly. Koda Calder, companion animal, owner, Tate Calder. He stared at the word owner and shook his head. No, he said. Wren looked worried. Is something wrong? Tate reached down and touched the faded red collar. Not owner. Koda lifted his head. Partner, Tate said. Wren smiled. I don't think the form has that box. Bad form. I'll file a complaint with the committee. Koda thumped his tail once against the floor. That evening, Tate cooked dinner for the first time since coming home. Nothing grand. Fried potatoes, eggs, a little ham cut small. For Koda, a proper bowl with dog food, the biscuit Mrs. Jensen had made, and one tiny piece of ham Tate pretended was accidental. The cabin windows glowed gold against the canyon dark. Outside, Black Hill's stone held the last blue of twilight. The creek, freed from winter, moved below with the restless voice of thaw. Stars appeared one by one above the pines. Old fires watching a small human light refuse to go out. Inside, Tate set one plate on the table. Then he set Koda's bowl beside the hearth. He paused. For years, supper had been a task. A plate, a chair, a man eating because the body required fuel. Tonight, it looked different. 2 places. 2 breaths in the room. 2 survivors of systems that had labeled them damaged and tried to move them aside. Koda lowered himself beside the bowl but did not eat right away. He looked at Tate, waiting. Tate carried his plate to the chair, then stopped. Slowly, carefully, he knelt beside the old dog. His ribs protested, his leg complained, his pride, that ancient fool, had no useful opinion left. He pressed his forehead to Koda's. The shepherd's fur smelled faintly of smoke, snowmelt, and the clean leather oil Wren had used on his collar. Tate thought of the canyon, the wreck, the hearing room, the county file with his life reduced to symptoms, the old red collar with letters almost erased. He thought of Jonah Vale's coin in his pocket, of Doss handing him keys, of Mara's shame, of Eloise's tin box, of Wren's penlight, of Lon's ridiculous thermos, of Eli sitting wordless on the porch while Koda held his shaking still. He did not feel victorious. He felt present. That was better. "Good boy," Tate whispered. Koda closed his eyes. Outside, the canyon darkened, but the cabin held its light, and for the first time in many years, it no longer looked like a place where an old soldier waited to disappear. It looked like a home. Sometimes, healing does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes, it comes quietly, through a dog that refuses to leave, a neighbor who finally speaks the truth, a warm light left on in a lonely cabin. Tate and Koda remind us that no life is too broken to be used for good again. God's grace often reaches us through small, faithful things. A hand on our shoulder, a friend at the door, or even an old dog standing guard in the snow. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from, and if you believe animals can be part of God's quiet miracles. May your home be warm, your heart be steady, and may you never forget. Even after the longest winter, love can still find its way back inside.